Hello, and welcome to this week's episode of Beauty History. I am your host, Allison Chase, but my friends call me Allie. So for today's video, we're going to dive into the life, legacy, and complicated history of Christian Dior. But before we go any further, let's take a second to grab our iced coffee or a hot coffee. Let's take a sip and let's get started. When I think of the aesthetic of Christian Dior, I think of something hyper feminine. I think of a girly girl. I think of a type of femininity that is classic and timeless. So I think for today's video, we're going to go ahead and create something unabashedly feminine. Now, all of the makeup and makeup tools used will be in the description box down below. So let's go ahead and dive into this complicated history and legacy of Christian Dior. So he was born on January 21st, 1905. I'm going to go ahead and use this Dior 5 Couleurs eyeshadow palette, number 057 Moonlight. He was born in Granville, which is a small seaside town in Normandy. So he grew up on the countryside and he was the second of 5 children. He grew up in a very wealthy family. He was born to a father who was a fertilizer manufacturer, and at the time of his birth, his family had a lot of money. From a young age, Christian was a mommy's boy, a mama's boy, whatever you want to call it. He was obsessed with his mother. He adored her. He thought that she was just the bee's knees. He was obsessed with her. And we have to remember the time that he was born, 1905. So her sense of fashion was very influenced by La Belle Époque, which is a time in France from 1870 to the outbreak of the First World War, so the 19-teens basically. So this style of dressing for women was very beautiful. It used corsets, it emphasized curves, it used padding on the hips and on the backside, and it showed off a bust. It was very voluptuous, very feminine, and he, as I mentioned, adored his mother, and he also adored her sense of style, and he really loved and was influenced by this style of that decade, La Belle Époque. And we will see this later on in the video. So at a young age, his parents decided for him that he would become a diplomat. You know, I think it's quite often that parents decide the future of their children without consulting their children. So this was the case for him. At a young age, his parents moved from the seaside of Normandy to Paris. And when he was in Paris, his parents enrolled him in school to pursue his career as a politician. His parents enrolled him at École des Sciences Politiques, which is a political science high school, I guess we could call it. And that's where he did his studies. But even as he was doing his studies to become a diplomat, he always had that inclination towards art and drawing and sketches and fashion, regardless of his parents' ambitions for him. So while he was at school, he would draw and sketch, and he would actually sell his sketches to make a bit of side money. So after he graduated from this institute in 1928, his father decided to give him a bit of money because, as I mentioned, his father was very wealthy. And so Dior decided that he wanted to open up a very small art gallery because he always had that inclination towards art. And so his father agreed to give him money to open a very small art gallery as long as he didn't use the family name on the art gallery. That's how little faith he had in this gallery. But Christian opened this little art gallery, and in this tiny, minuscule art gallery, he sold the works of Georges Braque, as well as Pablo Picasso. Dior's small art gallery would be the first to show Dali's melting clocks. Now going into the shade over here, I'm just placing it in the crease. However, his life as an art dealer was very short-lived, and he was forced to close this art gallery in 1931 due to several factors. First of all, the Great Depression had ramifications worldwide, and as I mentioned, his father was a wealthy fertilizer manufacturer. However, because of the Great Depression, he lost control of the company and ultimately lost the family wealth. And in the same year, 1931, both Christian Dior's brother and mother passed away suddenly and unexpected. Now, I cannot imagine any family losing two family members in the same year, as well as losing the family business, so this was quite devastating. I just went ahead and added a little bit of this lip oil just to hydrate my lips a bit. So after some time, he was hired by Robert Piguet to work as a fashion assistant for his house. And he was quite lucky because he was actually able to create 3 collections while working at this house. And this time was quite valuable to Christian because Robert Piguet turned out to be a bit of a mentor to him. He would later say that Robert Piguet taught me the virtues of simplicity through which true elegance must come. So this was quite a formative time for him and he learned a lot. I'm going to go ahead and switch into my Couleurs Wild Earth palette, number 786 Terra. I'm going to put this in the crease as well. So when he was working at this house, Piguet, he worked alongside one of the greats, Pierre Balmain, and also Marc Bohan. Marc Bohan would also go on to dress the likes of Princess Grace Kelly and also Betsy Bloomingdale of the Bloomingdale fortune. So even though we might not hear the name Robert Piguet as a household name, it was quite a formative space for many creative minds at the time. So one of the collections that Dior created was something called Café Anglais, which was very well received. And please keep in mind this silhouette because it's going to come back in the future when Dior has its own proper fashion house. Now, we are talking about France and Paris in the 1930s, so I think many of you should know it's coming up soon. Dior was forced to leave the Robert Piguet fashion house because France was at war. And so he was conscripted into the French military and he served in the military. I'm not sure how much time, but he was stationed in the south of France until France's surrender to German occupation, at which point he returned to Paris. Now, I would like to take a moment to talk about one of Christian's sisters, Kathleen Diaw. So while Christian was in the south of France and then eventually returned to Paris, Kathleen was part of the French resistance. And she was part of the Polish intelligence base in France. Her unit, I guess you could say, was focused on learning information about German weaponry and also the German army movement. So quite important. Unfortunately, she was captured. She was also tortured for information, which she refused to give. So she was subsequently sent to Ravensbrück concentration camp, and she spent the remainder of the war there until her liberation in 1945. Legend has it that Christian named the perfume Miss Dior after his sister as a tribute to her. So, back to Christian. He went back to Paris after his service was over. He began to work for a house and a man named Lucien Lelong. Lucien Lelong is another name that is not a very common household name, but has a very interesting backstory. So let's talk about him very briefly. So at the time of the war, Lucien Lelong had a fashion house, and Christian Dior was hired by him to be an employee to create dresses, etc. But also at the time of the war, during the occupation, Lucien Lelong was president of a federation of fashion and haute couture houses. There was basically a governing body of haute couture in France, and Lucien Lelong was president of said association. Now, when the Germans took over in Paris, they made it clear that they had plans to transplant Paris and French haute couture to Berlin. So they were planning on basically kidnapping dressmakers, hat makers, designers, artisans of every kind, and taking them to Berlin and making them create fashion. And they wanted Berlin to become the hub of haute couture. So Lucien Lelon argued. He said that that would be impossible because every artisan, whether it's a hat maker, a dressmaker, someone who embroiders lace, these are all crafts that take an entire lifetime to master. And the reason that Paris is so good at what it does is because they have a legacy of one student coming in and learning the craft. And it's taken a very, very, very long time and lots of generations to learn and master these crafts, and transplanting artists to a different city would not work. And so his plan actually worked, and the Germans listened to him. However, this meant that Lucien Lelon's fashion house, as well as others like Jeanne Lanvin and Nina Ricci, would dress the Nazi officers' wives as well as French collaborators. So during the war, Christian Dior worked for a company that dressed these people. As I mentioned earlier, this history is complicated. Let's go into our complexion products and then we'll finish up the eyes afterwards. I am going into the Dior Forever Skin Glow in 2WO. So that was that. Now, once the war finally ended, Christian was able to open up his actual house. It's amazing how much history there was before he opened up his own fashion house. But in 1947, with backing of some very wealthy businessmen, he was able to open up the Christian Dior Haute Couture fashion house. Now, 1947, technically the war is over, but a lot of people are still feeling the ramifications and effects of the war. People had gone through years of rations with food and fabric as well. So fashion was definitely something that was felt by the war as well. You know, the way people dressed and the types of fabrics they were allowed to use was influenced. So once Christian opened up his fashion house, he had basically had enough of seeing women in boxy, brown, drab dresses that were short, that were appropriate to wear in a factory. You know, if you work in a factory for ammunitions, you're probably not wearing a ball gown and corset and, you know, all those things. And so, as I mentioned earlier, he was slightly obsessed with La Belle Époque and the corsets and the hourglass figure and the voluptuousness. So this was a sense of fashion that he wanted to call back to. For the concealer, I'm using the Clé de Peau concealer in the shade called Almond, because I think for him, this fashion reminded him of a simpler time. It was like thinking of the good old days. It reminded him of his mother, who he absolutely loved, and it just reminded him of a time before rationing, before having to think of practical clothing. It was a time when wealthy women, obviously, could wear just the most elaborate, glamorous makeup and, or not makeup, sorry, clothing. So women would dress glamorously for the sake of being glamorous. That was the point. And so he missed that, and that's what he wanted to call back to. So when he came out with his first collection in 1947, he named it Couleurs, which is a botanical term for flowers because he loved flowers. And this is where you see that influence of La Belle Époque. He wanted to bring back corsets. He wanted to bring back that over-exaggerated hourglass figure. He wanted to emphasize the bust and the waist and just everything and have it just be extra and glamorous and voluptuous. And that's what his collection was. It wasn't boxy, it wasn't practical, it was It was a callback to La Belle Époque. I'm just going into a bit of bronzer with the Backstage palette here. So this entire collection, this look, was called the New Look. And it wasn't Dior who coined this term. It was actually the editor-in-chief of Harper's Bazaar at the time who called this the New Look, and it stuck. What's interesting is that at the time, feminists hated the New Look. They felt newly liberated because they weren't wearing corsets. They didn't have to wear floor-length gowns. They just felt more liberated and free. And one of his biggest haters, you could say, was Coco Chanel. She despised this look. She despised everything about it. You know, she was the one removing corsets. She was wearing pants. She was dressing women in a more boyish, liberated way. And so Dior's sense of fashion and his whole aesthetic and ideals were completely opposite to her, and they did not like each other. She was quoted as saying that Dior did not dress women, he upholstered them, like you upholster furniture. So yeah, he was even nicknamed the Tyrant of the Hemline because his dresses were so long, and at the time, women had gotten used to wearing shorter dresses. So the following collections were a little bit more toned down and demure, but they still remained New Look. It was a callback to being ultra feminine. I'm going back into this shade right here, and I'm going to trace it on the bottom lashes. Something interesting to note is at the time, Dior was one of the first haute couture houses to license his name so that he could create items and accessories with his name on it and the Christian Dior name. So hats, gloves, ties, any glasses, sunglasses. He was the first one to do so because at the time it was considered a bit gauche, a bit, I don't know, a bit cheap in a way. That when he started doing this, a lot of other fashion houses and people looked at him a bit strange. They thought he was cheapening the name of his fashion house, but it turned out that creating accessories to go with the new look, because the new look was not complete without the right shoes, the right gloves, the right hat, the right belt, etc. And so he was one of the first to pioneer putting the name on every single accessory you can think of, and it actually turned out to be extremely lucrative for him. For the blush, I'm going into this shade number 459, Charnelle. I'm just gonna go ahead and dip into the gold shade of the Backstage highlighter, which I find quite interesting because I think now we take for granted that fashion houses would have their name on every accessory we can think of, but there was a time when that wasn't the case. Now, to finish off the look, I'm going to go into my Chanel Stylo Yeux number 88 waterproof and the Chanel Volume mascara. This feels so contradictory to use both of these brands in the same video when I'm talking about Dior, but unfortunately, I do not have an eyeliner or a mascara at the moment from Dior, so you will have to forgive me. And then for the lip, I will finish it off with this Rouge Dior number 999, their classic iconic red. What's interesting about Christian Dior as a head designer and owner of an haute couture fashion house is that his time as such was very brief. He passed away in 1957. In what is believed to have been his third heart attack. He was on vacation in Italy and unfortunately he passed away. So his moment in time as being the owner of his own fashion house was quite brief, but his mark on fashion and history is quite impressive because personally, when I think of the 1950s glamour, 1950s fashion, even 1950s stereotypical housewife, I think of the new look shape. I think we underestimate the impact that the new look shape had on fashion and history and pop culture. Because when we look at starlets of the time in the 1950s and 60s, we do see a callback to more voluptuous and curvaceous figures. We see stars with big busts and small waists, and I think that this was very influenced by the new look, which was influenced by La Belle Époque. So even though Christian Dior's time as the owner and operator of his own fashion house was not lasting decades long, the impact that he had was quite significant. And I think that says a lot, because I can't think of the 1950s fashion without thinking of the new look in some way. Whether it's subconscious or not, I think of the new look. As I mentioned earlier as well, he was one of the first to pioneer licensing his name on every accessory he could imagine to complete the new look, which was not well received initially, but proved very lucrative in the end. At the time of his death, the Christian Dior fashion house was estimated to make $12 million annually back in the day. I tried to do a bit more research on his personal life, but unfortunately there aren't many sources available. There wasn't much in his personal life about who he dated or any information like that. So I feel like this video is complete, but it also leaves a bit of mystery about who he was. We know a bit about his interests. You know, he was a mama's boy and what he studied when he was younger, but there still leaves a bit to the imagination. And I think that's interesting to have a fashion house that's so iconic and has such a legacy, but also it has a little bit of mystery and leaves us wanting a little bit more. I hope you guys enjoyed today's video. If you like this video, I post nothing but luxury and makeup reviews, tutorials, and also videos on beauty history. So if that interests you, please like, comment, and also subscribe. I think this about does it for today's video. So I hope you guys enjoyed it. I hope you guys had a beautiful day, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye.